There are many ways in the English language to express the idea of retribution. For instance, we say everything that goes around comes around. And we say things like, things have a way of working out in the end. Or we teach our children crime doesn't pay. Or we talk about the chickens coming home to roost, or the skeletons rattling out of the closet. Some of our greatest questions or quotations deal with this idea of retribution. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who in one of the greatest speeches for which he is justly famous, said, "The arm of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Thomas Jefferson, one of my favorite quotes, said, and this was speaking on the evils of the slave trade, he said, "I tremble when I remember that God is just." One of the most famous quotations on this theme is the little two-line couplet translated by Longfellow. He said, "Though the mills of God grind slowly, yet they grind exceedingly small." The Bible has a lot to say about retribution. And I'm sure you've heard of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand and a foot for a foot, a life for a life. Two of the most famous Bible verses speaking about retribution come from Numbers 32:33 that says, "Be sure your sin will find you out." And Galatians 6:7 says, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man sows, that he shall also reap." Jacob has been sowing for a long, long time, and reaping day has come. He's been sowing the seeds of deceit, and the harvest is about to come. Now, when we last left our hero, he's just awakened, remember, from a hard night's sleep, and he was laying on a rock on the outside of Luz, and during the night, he had that strange dream, remember, of the ladder stretching from heaven to earth, and in that dream, the Lord himself spoke to Jacob, reassuring him as he went that God would go with him. Now, it happened while Jacob was on this long journey from Beersheba in the south of Palestine to a place way to the north and the east called Haran, a distance of about 500 miles. And it meant leaving the promised land and venturing into a territory that Jacob had never entered before. Now, before that night at Bethel, Jacob's heart was filled with fear. And afterwards, he walked with a new spring in his step. Before, he felt the weight of his past. But afterwards, after that dream, after that message from God, he looked with excitement to the future. And before, he was running for his life, right, from Esau. But afterwards, he was running to find a home and a wife. All of that and more is implied by the very first phrase in Genesis chapter 29, is where we're going to be right now. Genesis chapter 29 and verse 1 literally reads, it says, "Then Jacob lifted up his feet." This sort of suggests a new spring in his step as a result of his encounter with God there at Luz, at Bethel. And if before he was a fugitive, now he was a seasoned traveler. And after many days of traveling, Jacob arrives at Haran. He plans to stay there for just a few months, find a wife, and then return home to his family or to his mother in Beersheba. Well, little does he know that Haran is going to be his home for 20 long years. And little does he know that what awaits him are hard times in Haran. Now, Genesis 29 explains for us the 4 reasons why God sent him to Jacob. First of all, it was to find a wife, verses 1 through 12. When Jacob finally arrives, and you need to sit down and read this chapter, okay? I'm not going to read it to you word for word. We'll highlight some scriptures in here. But when Jacob finally arrives on the outskirts of Haran, the first thing he saw is a well and sheep herders nearby. And when Jacob asked the shepherds if they knew of a man by the name of Laban, they replied, yes, we know him. And at that very moment, seemingly by coincidence, but actually by the providential hand of God, the shepherds pointed to a beautiful young woman who was walking towards their sheep, towards that well, and she happened to be Rachel, Laban's daughter. Now, S. Lewis Johnson points out that this striking example of divine providence illustrates the fact that God guides the steps of his own without ordinarily interfering with the usual courses of life. He simply guides them in the exercise of their senses and intelligence. And believers today should learn to practice the same art of discerning the finger of God in the common events of life. This is evidently one of those rare cases of love at first sight, because when Jacob saw Rachel, Genesis 29:11 says that he kissed Rachel and he began to weep aloud. But this is more than just a sentimental emotion, okay? Jacob rejoices because he recognizes this as his chance meeting with Rachel, the providential care of God. He said, as Lewis Johnson said, he said, anyone who has ever experienced the providence of God will understand the weeping of Jacob. And since Rachel was the daughter of Laban, and Laban was the brother of Jacob's mother, Rebekah, that means that Jacob and Rachel were actually first cousins, kissing cousins, you could say. And in any case here, clearly Rachel doesn't mind the kiss because she runs to tell her father Laban, which brings us to our second reason that God sent Jacob to Haran, and that is to meet his uncle Laban, verses 13 and 14. Let me read those two verses for you. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him and he kissed him and brought him into his home, and there Jacob told him all these things. Then Laban said to him, "You are my own flesh and blood." Uncle Laban is going to change Jacob's life forever. And up until this point, Jacob has sort of lived by his wits, right? He's survived by relying on his native intelligence and his shrewd ability to take care of himself in any situation. And true, things haven't always worked out for him, but even when the things have gone bad, Jacob has somehow managed to land on his feet, sort of like a cat with 9 lives. And Jacob's been getting into and out of tough spots his entire life. Sometimes he's left the playing field with a black eye, but no matter, he's left, always left, walked off under his own power. And all that is about to change because in Uncle Laban, Jacob is finally going to meet his match. Before this, Jacob has lived as sort of a penny con man, pulling the wool over his brother's eyes, deceiving his father with that ridiculous goat skin thing, right? Kid stuff, you might say. But unfortunately, Jacob has been playing in the little leagues. When he meets Laban, he's going to be joining the big leagues of con men. Laban is about to take Jacob to the cleaners, and there's nothing that Jacob can do about it. In the providence of God, Jacob is about to be enrolled in the oldest school known to man, the school of hard knocks. And Uncle Laban is about to give his nephew 20 years of free postgraduate education. And that brings us to the third reason that God sends Jacob to Haran, and that is to marry Leah, verses 14 through 25. And to understand this point, you simply need to know that Rachel had an older sister named Leah, okay? The text is rather specific on the point of the comparison of the outward beauty of these two daughters of Laban, okay? It said Leah had weak eyes, and we're not quite sure what that means. Perhaps it means they were dull in appearance, or maybe it means that they were delicate in appearance, which could be seen as a compliment. But Rachel was, according to the scriptures, lovely in form and beautiful. And, that is, maybe Leah had striking eyes, but Rachel, she was beauty from head to toe, right? So Jacob didn't fail to notice the difference here. In fact, the text says that Jacob was in love with Rachel. And what you have is Leah the older, unlovely, unloved, and Rachel the younger, lovely and loved. And thus the stage is set. Jacob moves in with Laban. He goes to work for him. When Laban asks, he says, "What should your wages be?" Jacob is ready with the answer. He says, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your youngest daughter, Rachel." And Laban responds with a practical wisdom of a father with 2 daughters on his hands, right? He said, "It's better that I give her to you than to some other man." Now stay with me. This isn't this isn't a ringing endorsement, but most fathers of daughters can understand that sentiment, right? So he tells him, he says, better I give her to you than some other man, so why don't you come stay with me? So this is a straightforward sort of business proposition. He says, I'll give you 7 years of labor. At the end of that 7 years, that 7-year period, you're going to give me your daughter Rachel as my wife. So the 7 years pass, and the Bible sums up this period in one of the most strikingly beautiful verses in all the Bible. It says, in verse 20, it says, so Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Samuel Taylor Coolidge said that no man could be a bad man who loved as Jacob loved Rachel. And all I can say is this, okay? If you don't understand that verse, it's because you've never really been in love. If you've ever been in love, you know exactly how Jacob felt. Now, we've come to the wedding night. Well, first there's this huge feast. Okay, they did weddings a little different back then. Huge feast in honor of the couple. That probably took all day. Then that night, the husband retired to his chambers. The bride was escorted by the father to meet the groom, and thus the marriage was consummated. Okay, until that point, everything had gone as planned. But Uncle Laban has a surprise in store for Jacob. It says, when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and gave her to Jacob, and Jacob lay with her. Now, there are many questions that are rolling through my mind, anyway, that I'd like to ask at this point. The main one being, how in the world could something like this happen, right? And the answer is, okay, it couldn't in modern day American wedding customs. This thing couldn't happen without somebody knowing about it, right? No man could be fooled this way, but weddings in the ancient Near East, they followed a very different pattern than ours do. And the most likely explanation is that when Laban brought his daughter Leah to Jacob, it was very late, it was very dark, she was veiled from head to toe, okay? There had been much drinking going on at the feast, and that might have impaired Jacob's faculties just a little bit. And although the Bible doesn't say anything about this, in the darkness, somehow Jacob didn't realize that the woman laying next to him was Leah and not Rachel. So the marriage was consummated, but with the wrong woman. Other questions, that you might ask here is where was Rachel? Text doesn't tell us. Did she know about the swap? Why did Leah go along with this? Was it a case of two sisters competing for the same man? Did Leah feel jealous for her younger sister, more beautiful sister? Okay, we don't know that for sure, but Genesis 30 may sort of lead one to conclude that there was some jealousy going on here between these two sisters. But verse 25 tells us the whole story. Okay, it says, when morning came, there was Leah. Okay, in the Hebrew, that phrase contains two words. It's behold Leah. Behold Leah. He wakes up a contented man. He just got married to the woman he loved. He worked 7 years for this lady. He rolls over to give Rachel a kiss, and there, the face smiling back at him is not Rachel. It's Leah. I'm surprised he didn't have a heart attack, And then it hits him. Hey, I just slept with the wrong woman. How could this have happened? And then a second thought probably hits him. Laban, Laban. It had to be that Laban because he was the one who brought this bride to my chambers. And with that thought in mind, Jacob bolts out of bed, puts on his robe, and he goes after Laban. In Genesis 29, verse 25, Jacob asks Laban a very crucial question. He asks him, he says, why have you deceived me? That's a good question, right? But unknowingly, Jacob has used a same Hebrew word, the same form of Hebrew word that Isaac used when he told Esau that Jacob had deceived him back in Genesis 27, verse 36. Bingo. Bingo. The noose has tightened around Jacob's neck, and he doesn't even know it yet, okay? The chickens are coming home to roost. The arm of the universe is long, but it leans towards justice. It bends towards justice. Laban, rather coolly, replies, that he was forced to. He had to give Leah first because she was the oldest. It was custom to give the older daughter in marriage first. And this is the second direct hit here to Jacob, okay? Jacob had dishonored the principle of the firstborn by cheating his brother out of the birthright and the blessing. Now, you see what God's doing? God forces him to honor the principle he had violated by marrying Leah first. All right? The principle of the firstborn. And who had Jacob deceived? He deceived his father, Isaac, right? Well, now the deceiver is being deceived by his father-in-law. Everything that goes around comes around. You reap what you sow. And that brings us to the final reason God sent Jacob to Haran, and that is to marry Rachel, verses 26 through 30. Now, the story now moves very swiftly to its conclusion. Knowing a sucker when he's got one on the line here, Laban moves in for the kill. He offers to let Jacob marry Rachel as well, but with one tiny condition. He must serve Laban for another 7 years. Genesis 29:28 simply says, and Jacob did so. Jacob completes the bridal week for Leah, then he eventually marries Rachel on the spot, and then he begins his second 7 years for service to Laban. And verse 30 offers this final note. It says, Jacob lay with Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. A fact that's going to bring so much sorrow to Leah down the road, much bitterness between these two sisters, and so much dissension to the children yet to be born. What a story here. God gets even with this wayward servant who was all too willing to cheat others. But I want to note carefully here, okay? God evens the score in the very areas that Jacob had been cheating in. Did you notice that? He deceives Esau and his father. Now his father-in-law deceives him. He ignores the principle of the firstborn rights by cheating Esau, but now he is forced to honor that principle by marrying Leah first. And Esau was forced to live with the results of Jacob's deception, and now Jacob is being forced to live with the results of Laban's deception. So now that we've looked at the story, okay, let's go behind the scenes and let's ask why God really sent Jacob there to Haran, okay? We know the facts. Now let's go after the reasons behind them. The first reason is so that Jacob would have plenty of time to think about the way he had lived his life. For all those years in the promised land, Jacob had richly earned the title deceiver, okay? But now God puts Jacob in sort of a spiritual timeout, right? All right? Here in Haran. For 20 years, Jacob had lots of time to consider the course of his life. And all parents understand this, okay? Some parents use the timeout chair. We didn't use it, but some parents do use that timeout chair and they do it in order to give their children time to quietly think about what they've done. Or perhaps maybe you just send your children to their room, right? And that serves several purposes, including preventing homicide, right? But foremost among them is giving your child a chance to slow down, right? Cool off, and to think about what they did. And as long as Jacob was in Beersheba, he could get away with almost anything. But in Haran, Jacob's in a foreign territory. God's got him in a place far removed from his comfort zone, a place where Jacob is forced to think about his life and the things he had done. And that's what God does with us, right? From time to time, he just sits us down and he tells us, he says, you don't need that job anymore. You need some time to think. Or he says, I'm going to put you in the hospital for a couple weeks so you'll have time to think. Or I'm going to let your dreams crumble so you can consider the way you've been living. Why did God send Jacob to Haran? So that Jacob would have plenty of time to think about the way he lived, but also so that God could humble Jacob at the point of his perceived strength. If you had to ask Jacob, what is your strong point? He would no doubt say, I know how to cut a deal. I know how to handle people. I know how to negotiate a contract. Then he would have said, I'm always in control. No one ever gets the best of me. Well, when he meets his uncle, Laban, all of his boasting comes to nothing. Suddenly, he's no longer in control. He's not at the top of the food chain anymore. He cut a deal and then he ended up losing. He negotiated a contract and Uncle Laban snookered him. Do you see what God has done here? He has touched Jacob at the point of his perceived strength, and he has humbled him. Wasn't there a man in the New Testament that was like that? Remember Peter? Peter said, even though everyone else denies you, I will never deny you. And Jesus said, before the cock crows, Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. It's the principle. God humbled Peter at the point of his self-perceived strength. He did the same thing with Jacob. God does that same thing for you and me, touching us at the point where we feel like we're the strongest, okay? And he brings us down so that we will understand our confidence must be in him alone. He wants us to know that even our strength comes from him. Another reason God sent Jacob to Haran is so that godly character would be developed through unjust treatment. Was Jacob treated unfairly here? Yeah, without a question. We can't say that he wasn't, right? Laban took advantage of his nephew from Beersheba. Was it fair for Laban to switch sisters on Jacob? No, it wasn't fair. What was the price Jacob had to pay? An extra 7 years working for his uncle Laban. That was unjust. Yes, it was. Then why did God allow it? Because God knew that was the only way that he could develop godly character in Jacob's life. So many people go through life and they say things like, that's not fair. And that may be true, okay? But you know what? God has never promised life is going to be fair or that he will deal fairly with you. He never promised that the world would treat you justly, okay? If God treated us all justly, we'd all be burning in hell. That's the truth. If God would let his son be crucified while he was innocent of all wrongdoing, do you think he will exempt you and me from unjust treatment? There's no way. It's not going to happen. The great danger for us is that in reacting to the unjust treatment, we become perpetual victims. First we get angry, then we get bitter, then we start to victimize ourselves. I know some people, even some good Christians, who go through life as these perpetual victims. Someone's always mistreating them. Someone's always misusing them. They're always taking advantage of them. They're always angry with God because he doesn't make things happen the way they want it to happen. And for the most part, godly character is not developed in the good times of life, but in the bad. Godly character is developed in your life as you respond positively and creatively to unjust treatment. Isn't that what Romans chapter 5, verses 3 and 4 tells us? It says we rejoice in our sufferings because we know that our suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character. Character, hope. One thing leads to another. And what begins as injustice leads to perseverance, which leads on to character, which leads on to hope in God. But if you say, well, nobody can mistreat me, then really what you're saying is, I'm not going to allow God to develop his character in my life. That's why I love the statement that Jim Warren shared years ago. He said, when you're in trouble and you feel circumstances piling up against you, the key to survival is be a student, not a victim. A victim says, why is this happening to me? A student says, what can I learn from this? Another reason God sent Jacob to Haran is so that his plans for the future might be worked out through human weakness. When Jacob comes to Haran, he's penniless, he's homeless, he's alone. When he leaves 20 years later, he's a rich man. He has 2 wives, 2 maidservants, 11 sons, a host of other servants, an abundance of cattle, sheep, and donkeys. He came there with nothing, but he leaves a man of means, a rich man. In between, however, he suffers repeated humiliation at the hand of Laban. Now, what's going on here? Well, on one hand, okay, God is using Laban to teach Jacob valuable lessons. But on the other hand, God is keeping his promise to Jacob to prosper him and raise up for him descendants who will carry on his name. Through adversity and in spite of much personal difficulty, God is keeping his promise to Jacob. In the wisdom of God, Jacob is being prospered by God at the very same time he's being disciplined by God. And the result? What was the result? Jacob has nothing to boast about when he leaves Haran, okay? God has done it all. He has kept his promise, and he has allowed his servant to experience great hardship. Jacob will never be able to say, hey, I did it. He's only going to be able to say, God did it in spite of me. Okay? As 1 Corinthians says, it says God chooses the weak things of this world in order that he might confound the strong. He chooses the foolish to shame the wise, so that no one may boast before him. Jacob is not the only one to make the long journey out of the promised land to a foreign city like Haran. God still sends his children to Haran today. Here's a working definition of Haran, okay? Haran is any place in your life where you are experiencing suffering and difficulty. It could be a relationship. It could be your marriage. It could be your work situation or a financial condition. Haran might be that impossible person you have to work with every day, or it might be a troubling health condition. Why does God still send his children to Haran? Why doesn't he just let us stay in the promised land? Well, Hebrews 12:11 says, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness. You see, when God sends you to Haran, it's not because he hates you, it's because he loves you. It's not because he wants to destroy you, it's because he wants to make you stronger. Okay? The road to the promised land goes through Haran. In the course of a lifetime, most of us will make several extended trips to Haran. Okay? No one's exempt. No one gets a free ride. I want to close with an unusual question. Have you ever thanked God for sending you to Haran? Have you ever thanked God for that part of your life that's bringing you suffering and difficulty? Have you thanked him for it? You've been bitter, you've been angry, you've been depressed, you wanted to give up. But have you ever tried thanking God for your personal Haran? Have you ever said to the Lord, Lord, this is so painful, but I believe you know what you're doing. I don't understand it. I don't see the big picture, but I thank you for allowing me to go through this because it has brought me closer to you. Your life could be transformed if, instead of getting angry, you begin thanking God for your personal Haran. I offer you no easy answers, okay? There's no quick fixes. There's no fast train to the promised land, all right? But I promise you this, if you are on your way to Haran right now, if you're going through difficult times right now, God has promised that he will go with you. And remember, like last week, he not only goes with you, but he goes ahead of you, right? And if you're living in Haran today, God has promised you that you're not going to stay there forever, right? That's the wonderful part. You're not going to stay there forever. He's going to bring you back to the promised land sooner or later. You want to go to the promised land? I hope you do. I'm planning on going, right? But if you do, the bus always stops in Haran. And while we're there, let us console ourselves with this thought. As painful as Haran may be, it's God's way of preparing us for better things to come.